So this presentation is part of my dissertation. In my dissertation, I'm examining the Israeli official memory, official meaning what the institution of the states adopted, regarding the case study of the 1948 Palestinian refugees. And I'm talking about, more specifically, about the causes for their exodus. Were they expelled? Did they left on their own will, etc.? So I'm examining this regarding three institutions of the states: the Israeli Army, the National Information Center, and the history textbooks used in the Ministry of Education. And in addition, I'm examining to see how four social institutions impacted these three state institutions. So I'm examining newspapers, research community, NGOs, and war veteran literature. And my research period is between 1949 to 2004. So I'm examining how, in all these seven institutions, how the causes for the exodus of the 1948 Palestinian refugees was presented. And here in the presentation today, I will present the findings regarding the research community, which is one of the institutions. In addition, one of the things that I do, I'm involved in a project which is examining the Israeli popular memory of the conflict. Popular meaning what do the people think about the events of the conflict. So in the dissertation, it's the official memory. This additional project is the popular one. And in contrast also to the dissertation, which concentrates only on the 1948 Palestinian refugees, in this survey, I'm examining with another person, we are examining the Israeli popular collective memory regarding many events of the conflict. So we mapped, for example, what do the Israeli society think about the Palestinian refugees, this I will tell later, what do they think about the 1967 war, and all kinds of events that happened, who started the war, who is to blame, etc. And then also we made all kinds of correlations between the collective memory, emotions towards Palestinians or Arab, political attitude, etc. So this is like a kind of a background. So I will start now, and if you want, it's not responding.
Try the up arrow, whatever.
Yeah, maybe it was some kind, took a break. Okay. And if you want to relate to something, each slide has a number, so you can write the number and then relate to the numbers. So in this presentation, I will introduce findings about the way the Israeli Jewish research community presented between 1949 and 2004 the causes for the exodus of the 1948 Palestinian refugees, and this in the context of collective memory of conflict. I then discussed the reasons for these findings. In terms of setting up the background, the context of this presentation. Collective memory is generally defined as representation of the past that are collectively adopted. With regard to collective memory of a conflict, it is composed of the way the party views the events that led to the eruption of the conflict and that occurred during the conflict. Usually, collective memory of conflict is biased and is formed to support the interests of the party that holds this memory. This collective memory has an active role in the course of the conflict, since it usually shapes positively the attitudes, emotions, and motivations of each party towards itself and towards the rival party in a negative manner. One of the important factors which impacts the collective memory of conflict is the historical memory of the conflict. That is, the way the research community views the events of the conflict. The research community includes scholars from the academy as well as non-academic scholars such as journalists or ordinary people who conduct research. By and large, historical memory is regarded less biased and more objective than the collective memory, though still it was criticized as having to some extent the above-mentioned characteristics of collective memory. That is, bias, serving the interests of its party, etc. With regard to the case study, The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an intractable conflict central in the world which lasted for about a century. In this conflict, the Palestinian refugee is of most salient and one of the biggest obstacles for resolving the conflict. In the framework of this political salience, the historical aspect of this problem with regard to the causes for the exodus of the Palestinians is of central importance, as it determines the party to the conflict who is responsible for it. As usually happens, the parties to the conflict form the collective memory of the conflict, and the research communities research these events of the conflict in general as well as particularly regarding the case study. Among the parties to the conflict, there are three main narratives regarding the causes for the 1948 refugee problem. Among the Israeli side, there exist two main narratives, the Zionist and the critical. In general, the Zionist narrative claims that the refugees left voluntarily for various reasons, including cause of Arab or Palestinian leadership to leave. While according to the critical narrative, some left voluntarily for different reasons, while others were expelled by the Jewish and later Israeli security forces. The Palestinian narrative is that the vast majority or all the refugees were expelled. The literature typically relates to the Jewish-Israeli historical memory regarding the case study as if until the late 1980s it was exclusively presenting the Zionist narrative, while from then onwards the critical narrative partly accompanied the Zionist narrative. Let us see whether this portrayal of the historical memory as it is in the literature is accurate and other characteristics of this historical memory. Briefly, in terms of methodology, the research deals mostly with books and a handful of articles and chapters in books, published between 1949 and 2004 in Hebrew or English, only by Jews from the research community living in Israel or outside of Israel. About the findings. 92 relevant studies were identified in the research, and the table presents their division according to periods in time. Do I sit okay? I'm not sure I'm sitting. It's better now, maybe? Yeah. So, just a second. With regard to the content of the table, the studies were classified according to the narrative that is presented in them, Zionist or critical. The division into periods is based upon the narrative presented in the study, as well as other characteristics described later, such as the rate of publication per year and the period or the extent of in that period, or the extent of discussion about the case study in the studies. Studies written by Israeli scholars were titled Israeli, while those written by scholars living outside of Israel were titled externals. Column 3 represents the years of the period, column 4 the length of the period, and column 5 the total studies published in that period. Briefly, according to the table, we can see that in period 1, we are talking about Israeli Zionist studies. In period 2, Israeli Zionist studies and external critical studies. In period 3, initial Israeli critical studies, while in period 4, Israeli critical studies consolidation. I will describe now these 4 periods in more details. In the first period, between 1949 and 1957, 5 studies were published, a rate of 0.6 a study per year. The vast majority of the studies were published by Israeli scholars and all presented the Zionist narrative, except for one which was published by an external scholar, which presented the narrative of both parties to the conflict, the Zionist and the Palestinian. The discussion of the case study in the studies was very peripheral, and it was not mentioned in the studies what they based the arguments regarding the case study upon. Here is an example of a typical presentation of the Zionist narrative in that period. So, when cities, towns and villages were seized by Jews, very rapidly grew the number of Arab refugees who abandoned their homes and fled to the Arab areas. Moving to the second period. In that period, between 1958 and 1976, 25 studies were published. That is, the publishing rate doubled to 1.3 studies per year. In that period, the external scholars became much more involved in the research and published a bit more than half of the studies. The Israeli scholars continued to present the Zionist narrative almost exclusively, except for one who presented the critical one, while the external scholar studies were divided. The majority of them presented the critical narrative, only 4 presented the Zionist narrative, while one presented the same two narratives of both parties to the conflict, the Zionist and the Palestinian one. The discussion in the case study was more elaborated, and while some studies continued not to mention the sources they based their arguments regarding the case study on, others mentioned that they were based on newspaper articles or studies conducted by others, including those of Arab or Palestinian scholars. Here is an example of a presentation of the critical narrative in that period. So, until about the end of May, beginning of June 1948, the refugees left areas under the Jewish control, and they left despite constant effort of the Jews persuading them to stay. From that time on, they were expelled from almost all the new areas which came under the Israeli control.
Safran is Israeli or is an external?
Safran is in this research is regarded as external. Just 2 words about him: he was an Israeli. He fought in the War of Independence. In 1950, he left to Harvard, and he stayed until not to Harvard. He left to study and stayed at Harvard until he died. Yeah. Nadav Safran is his name. In the third period, between 1977 and 1986, 13 studies were published. That is, the publishing rate remained as in the previous period, 1.3 study per year. In that period, the Israeli scholars tend to be, as in the first period, those that published the vast majority of the studies, and an additional drastic change occurred in that period. The vast majority of the studies included this time the critical narrative, in contrast to the Zionist narrative which they published in the previous period. The discussion in the case study remained the same as in the previous period, but a change occurred regarding the sources the studies were based on. While some studies continued not to mention the sources they based their arguments on, some did mention the sources, and among these, those that were published up to 1982 based their critical narrative on 1948 war veteran testimonies, while those that were published from then until the end of that period were based on archival documents, mainly Israeli. In the fourth and last period, between 1987 to 2004, 49 studies were published. That is, the publishing rate was doubled compared to the previous one and reached 2.7 studies per year. In that period, the Israeli scholars continued to be, as in the previous periods, those that published the vast majority of the studies, and the vast majority of the studies that they published continued to present the critical narrative. This period is different from the previous one, not only because the publishing rate doubled, as mentioned earlier, but also for a few other reasons. The discussion of the case study in general, and specifically in some of them, grew significantly, while some books were devoted exclusively to the case study, and others devoted special chapters for this topic. In addition, some of the books were based on wide documentation, mostly from Israeli sources, while others were based on other studies. And lastly, in the beginning of that period, 2 books of the historian Benny Morris were published, which were most significant, since he was the first scholar to devote whole books to the case study based on wide Israeli documentation and high-quality methodological research. Let us now discuss some aspects of the above findings. The findings show that unlike the way the literature usually discusses the Israeli Jewish historical memory of the case study, this memory was not Zionist until the late 1980s. Actually, this memory made a whole transformation, from being almost totally Zionist up to 1957, From then on, changing, being mostly Zionist but also partly critical, while from 1977 on, finishing its transformation to being almost totally critical. Another part of the discussion is the difference between the Israeli and external scholars. While the Israeli studies until 1976 almost exclusively presented the Zionist narrative of the case study, from then on a dramatic change occurred as such studies presented almost exclusively the critical narrative. But with regard to the external studies, they were present in a significant manner, in significant degree, only in the second period between 1958 and 1976, presenting mostly the critical narrative, while in the two following periods they were present only in a very minor way, presenting exclusively the critical narrative. That is, external studies started being critical much earlier, about 20 years before the Israeli one started. So the external started in 58 and the Israeli started in 77. I say in a meaningful manner. In addition, it is worthwhile to discuss the difference among the Israeli scholars between academic and non-academic scholars. Two significant related facts should be mentioned in this regard. First, about 95% of the studies which were conducted by Israelis from 1949 to 2004, whether they presented the Zionist or the critical narrative, were conducted by non-academic scholars. That is, Israeli academic scholars almost totally refrained from writing about the case study. Second, in continuation to the first point, among the Israeli scholars, the non-academic ones were almost the exclusive one to conduct critical studies about the case study, mostly from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. They, and among them significant place is reserved for Benny Morris, were actually those who had a significant part in paving the way to the change that occurred about 15 years later after 1977, in the way Israeli Academy discussed the case study in the fourth period. That is, actually starting to write about the case study and doing it in a critical manner. Until now we dealt with the descriptive part of the findings, but what about the explanatory one? How can we explain the above findings? Various phenomena occurred during the long research period and impacted the research of the case study. I will relate briefly to the major causes, first and mainly with regard to the way they impacted the Israeli scholars, and then at the end regarding how they impacted the external scholars. Until the 1970s, during the first two periods of the studies, various occurrences in Israel were promoting Zionist studies and heavily preventing critical ones. These occurrences were: Israel was involved in the Israeli-Arab conflict, and despite gaining victory during those periods, it felt insecure in its existence. This promoted collectivism, patriotism, and conformism in Israel. In this context, the case study was on the one hand not central in the Israeli public sphere most of this period, until the 1967 Six Days War, when Israel seized the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and even a few years later. Thus, there was less research conducted about the case study. On the other hand, the extent of taboo with regard to the critical narrative about the case study was relatively high. Describing and admitting to the critical narrative of the case study might provide the Arab or Palestinian with ammunition in their political struggle with Israel in the international arena. At the same time, the Israeli society had a few relevant characteristics. First, it was collectivism and conformism oriented due to the social background of Zionist Ashkenazi elites which immigrated to Eretz Israel, this is the land of Israel, before the establishment of Israel, and which in the first decades of the country almost exclusively controlled the state. The second reason, the second thing is the threat of the conflict described above, and the third reason for collectivism and conformism was the traditional inclination of the majority of the massive immigration to Israel after its foundation. This prevented to a large degree critical thinking and activity in Israel. The media was to a very significant extent controlled by the state or political parties. The radio and television from the late 1960s exclusively, and the main newspapers to a very large degree. This led to the prevention of dissemination of critical idea and information among the society. The Mapai political party and its successor Ma'arach, which were in power from 1948 until 1977, were to a very high extent in line with and supported by the Israeli elite, such as scholars, journalists, or authors. This prevented the elite from being too critical of the Zionist narrative adopted by the state by these parties. In contrast, from the 1970s until 2004, during the last two periods of the studies, critical research came more in favor. And though the situation was dynamic and gradually changed more in this direction as time passed. This was due to the following developments. Israel became more secure in its existence in the context of the conflict due to the economic and military strengthening, the 1979 peace agreement with Egypt, and the 1990s peace talks, including the 1994 peace agreement with Jordan. All this despite setback due to the eruption of the two Palestinian uprisings, the Intifadas, in 1987 and in 2000. In addition, the Yom Kippur and the First Lebanon War raised in Israel wide criticism, though each one of a different nature, against the political and military elites in Israel. In this context, the centrality of the Palestinians in general, and the case study particularly, increased, reaching its peak level in the late 1980s on, since the eruption of the First Intifada. This led to an increase in the research about the case study. At the same time, the extent of taboo regarding the critical narrative decreased, mainly due to the above described more secure feeling of Israel and to various processes which took place in the Israeli society as follows. Israeli society underwent during these years processes which led to its transformation. 1. It became much less collectivist and conformist and more individualistic and critically oriented. This was due to a change of the generation process, in which the older, more conservative and Zionist-oriented generation gradually gave more control over the state and social institutions to the younger and more critical generation. A decrease in the extent of the threat of the conflict. A less traditional second generation among the immigrants. Americanization processes which gradually gained more and more momentum in Israel, promoting values of individualism, human rights, pluralism, capitalism, and critical thinking. And the emergence or enhancement of various social cleavages based on religion, economic status, or origin, which led to the fragmentation of the society. About the media. From the mid-1970s on, the media became more privately owned and commercially oriented, to the extent that in the mid-1990s it was exclusively so. Also, in the mid-1990s experienced a wide deregulation of the electronic media influenced by Western countries, which led to the opening of dozens of new radio and television channels. All this led to a wider dissemination of critical ideas and information. In 1977, a political turnover took place in which the Ma'arach party was replaced by the Herut opposition party. This led to a rift between the state institutions and the elite, as the latter felt more free to be critical towards the state. Among the research community in Israel, two processes took place. On the one hand, a change of generation process in which younger, more critical scholars, not from the older generation, started gaining more impact in their research, while on the other hand, critical theories or methods of research, in example postmodernism or multiculturalism, developed in the international Western academia, gained more impact on the Israelis. In sum, what was described above influenced mostly Israeli scholars. Such processes as those that the Israeli society went through in the first two periods were manifested, for example, in tight censorship processes, conservative approaches by the academy, closure of archives, refusal of 1948 war veterans to give testimonies about the 1948 war, conservative approaches of the media with regard to disseminating critical information, refusal of publishers to publish critical books, etc. This had an impact on various phases of the research process. For example, why research in general and particularly about the case study was conducted, what made it possible to find critical information about the case study, what enabled critical manuscript to be published, etc. These were the reasons for the almost lack of critical Israeli studies in the first two periods, until 1976. But this impact was stronger on academic scholars who were constrained also by their institution and to a less extent upon non-academic scholars. Thus, these latter scholars, the non-academics, started already in the third period, since 1977, to publish critical studies. The liberal process having an impact on Israel gained more momentum as time passed since 1977. Parallel to this, Israel also felt the impact of the publication of the Israeli non-academic, mostly of Benny Morris, as well as the previous external critical publication. This gradually led to a change in the Israeli academia, which since the early 1990s had started publishing, and almost exclusively, critical studies about the case study. So what I'm describing here, that all these phenomena that I described above in Israeli society and in the conflict had an impact on the scholars. But in addition, there was a reciprocal impact from the studies, from the scholars on the society. Because gradually external scholars and then Israeli scholars started publishing critical studies, and this led to additional transformation of the society. So it was a dialectic process. In contrast, these phenomena were to a much lesser degree relevant to external scholars. This is why most of the external studies in the research period, including those published already as early as in the second period, were critical. For general theoretical purposes, the above described phenomena which impacted Israel can be conceptualized as the following variables that impact the historical memory of a conflict within a party involved in a conflict. So these are the variables. So the main general variables which can impact historical memory of a conflict are the situation of the conflict, the extent of centrality of the event, extent of taboo regarding the critical narrative about the event, the characteristic of the society, the characteristic of the media, the party in power, the characteristic of the research community, and the characteristics of the international arena, in example regarding historical research theories or decentralization of the media. Conclusion. The Israeli Jewish historical memory of the Palestinian refugee problem was dramatically transformed from 1949 to 2004, from Zionist to critical, by changes in the social and political environment. So here usually is when I finish my presentation, but I thought that I will add something additional more. That here I talked only about the research community, like the historical memory. So I would like also to say a few words about the popular memory, the collective memory, let's say, the popular collective memory of the refugees in Israel. So as I said, I and another person and we finished a survey in Israel conducted just lately. And so we have data about various events of the conflict, including what do the Jewish Israeli, we dealt only with Jews in Israel, what do the Israeli Jews think about the causes for the exodus of the 1948 Palestinian refugees. So it's interesting because there is awareness in Israel among the scholars that there is no data about the Israeli collective memory. But there are a few scholars that say, I also just read on the way now a book that was published by a well-known historian, Yoav Gelber's name in 2007, saying that the critical research published by critical historians about the 1948 Palestinian refugees did not penetrate to the public. So it seems that the situation is not so. The findings are like this. Among the Israeli Jews, 41% of them hold the Zionist narrative, that the Palestinians left on their own will. But 39% hold the critical narrative, that some left voluntarily while others were expelled. An additional 8% hold the Palestinian narrative, that they were whole or mostly were expelled. So and the additional 12% didn't know. So actually, critical or Palestinian narrative, together 39 plus 8 is 47, has a stronger hold in the Israeli society, in the Jewish sector in Israel than the Zionist one. And I think there is no data about what did the Jews think about this issue in the past, because it wasn't conducted. But I think most people would think that this is due to actually all various processes. I described only some of them that I described earlier, but of course also to the change, the transformation that occurred gradually in the historical memory of the case study. And in this case, a significant place is reserved for Benny Morris in this regard. So here I really finish, and if you have any questions, I would like to gladly answer. Yes.
I have several questions. First, how you decide? I mean, how you found the academic works that you studied? How you conducted the search, and also PhD dissertation and MA dissertation, they are also included in this in your data.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can tell us a little about what you found out in the school textbook regarding this, because that could be one of the explanations why the public eventually accepted perhaps the critical. Because if there is a chance in the school textbook, that could, people learn it at school, so now they change their mind about what happened to the Palestinians. And the last question, do you know anything about the demographic characteristic of the people who hold the critical, I mean, in the general, the popular collective memory of, is there any, you can say something about demographic characteristic of the people who hold the
Okay, so PhD dissertations are not included because the assumption was that they have less impact. If they were transferred to monographs and published as books, then they were, because I tried to see how social institutions like research community impact the state institutions. So dissertation as it is would be assumed to have little impact. But there were quite a few PhD dissertations, some of them a meaningful one, which were translated, which were transformed to books, and then I did include them. How did I find the books? Well, my assumption was that every book in Hebrew and English which deal with this issue would have at least one copy in Israeli high education system. So I examined the index of all the higher education institutions in Israel, which are colleges and universities, for all the books which were relevant. And so this is one. The other way was that I conducted interview with various scholars and also asked them if they knew. The third thing was, and it was very important, because when you deal with hundreds of books, then you read inside and you see what do they cite. So every book that was cited in there, I also went to look for this. So I can say that there is no way to find all the books. For sure there is no way to find all the books. I think I found many of them. And And I think in this sense, it's a sample. It's not a small sample like when you do a public opinion survey and you have nothing. It's a sample which represents the vast majority of them, and anyway it gives the picture. Even if you had more 10, it would give the general picture, I would think, of the general phenomena I found in the research. About the school textbooks. So actually all the 7 institutions were not researched from 49 to 2008 about the case study. There's a little bit, only textbooks were the only one that were researched, but they were researched in a different manner. They were research about books that were used in the educational system, and I examined all the books that were approved for use in the internet. So, because in the Israeli educational system, some of the books are approved by the Ministry of Education, and some are used without approval. And since I wanted to examine the official memory, so I examined only the books that were approved by the Ministry of Education. So in this sense, it's different. There are also other differences, but anyway, between this research and the previous one about the history books. But anyway, what I found is like this, and this is very interesting. Until 1975, all the books that were authorized for usage in the Israeli educational system contained the Zionist narrative. And then, relatively early, and this is very surprising because everybody is talking about the change maybe in the 1980s and then 90s. Already in the 1975 were published a few books, and also in the 1980s before Benny Morris were published a few books which contained the critical narrative. And the critical, or I call it Zionist critical, because some of them said that most of the refugees fled, but a little bit of them were expelled. So I call it like Zionist critical. It's more towards the Zionists, but still there is a critical element. And just to describe a little bit, because it's really interesting to understand, and I also interviewed the people who wrote these books. So it's really interesting to understand what really impacts the official memory of a state. So what happened is like this. So the Ministry of Education, they wanted to develop new curricula. So they sent in the late 1960s, they sent to the US, to Chicago. There was some school there which was very specializing in educational system and theories, etc. And they sent a few of the people from the Ministry of Education to go there to learn how to promote critical thinking in the Israeli society, etc. These people came to Israel and established in the beginning, in the late 1960s, they established the curricula department in the Ministry of Education. Now, these people were more critical in their attitude about education. They were also more leftish in their political attitudes, and they promoted the to contain. I know about the debates they had with other partners in their department. They promoted to include the critical narrative in the books. And there were fights, there were internal fights from the inspector of history. He was against them. There was a lot of cleavage inside, but still they succeeded to do it. So it started from the 1970s, continued in the 1980s, but people usually would talk about the 1990s because they are not aware of this. Yeah. So that's about the Ministry of Education. And about demographic, well, I cannot say it now because it's still in process of analysis of the survey. I cannot say exactly what are the characteristics of the people who hold the critical narrative, but I can say it's from another direction. What variables impact in what direction the narratives. So we found in a significant manner, it's not final, but I believe this is what it will be, that age was impacting significantly, but not in a large extent. Age was impacting in the sense that the more that the younger you are, you will be more critical. So the older generation would be more Zionist oriented. So, this is maybe trivial to think about it, but still you have to prove it. And when you prove it, so it's in this sense it's important. Income was also related in the same direction, in the sense that the higher your income, the more you will be critical. Religiosity impacted the opposite. So the more you are religious, the less you are critical. So in Israel, it's like this, that the religious people are more right-wing oriented. So apparently this is related. Political attitude was very, very strongly impacting the narrative. Actually, the most significant impact was by the political attitude. So this about basically this. Yes, please.
Hi. I have a few questions. One is when you talk about the Zionist narrative, are you talking about predominantly Ashkenazi narrative? Because the Zionists, or at least the early Zionists, were mostly Ashkenazi, and in constructing the collective memory, what role do you think the Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi perspective played in that? So if it was a predominantly Ashkenazi narrative, do you think it would have been a different one if it were a more Mizrahi one? And does the collective memory take that diversity into consideration, the diversity between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi population in Israel, as well as gender diversity? Is it more predominantly a male perspective than a female one?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will try some things to answer some, maybe if I didn't understand, so maybe you will ask again a little bit. So, just not to make a confusion, in this literature, when talking about Zionist, we are not talking about Ashkenazi or Sephardi. We are talking like this, the narrative which is promoting the interests of the Zionist movement, of the Israeli state, more in the pre-state period, or in the initial period after Israel was founded. So in this sense, Zionist doesn't talk about whether it's Sephardi or Ashkenazi. You can call it traditional narrative, you can call it conservative narrative, or something like this. So this is what people say. So this was, for example, people would say the Zionist narrative was characterizing Israel until the 1970s, 1980s, something like this. So there's no relation to origin. If I connect this to your second question, which I didn't understand exactly, but I will try, is the Ashkenazi people, for those maybe you don't know, maybe you know another. So the Ashkenazi, just in 2 words, the Ashkenazi would be the people who came from Europe, basically, and the Sephardi were people who came from Northern Africa or Asia or something like this, generally speaking. So the Ashkenazi were more dominant in all the period, even today, but in the beginning of Israel to a larger extent, because they were the one who immigrated in a larger scale before Israel was founded. So they controlled the main institutions in the Zionist movement before Israel was founded, in the Yishuv, which is the Israeli population before Israel was founded, and also after Israel was founded. So in this sense, they constructed everything the way they wanted. So they impacted the official memory, the popular collective memory, so they had a large impact. If I would have to think, if it would have been different, it's just hypothetical. If it was the Sephardi who were controlling, I don't know, but basically I guess they would have looked also to ways to promote the interest of the state. So maybe it would be the same. Now, did I answer your second question?
Pretty much. I guess because I've tried to do a little bit of research on push and pull factors of Mizrahi immigrants in Israel, and I guess Mizrahi and Sephardi, so Arab Jews and Jews from Spanish origin.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that in a lot of narratives, the pull factors were stronger than the push factors. So what caused them to migrate into Israel were more the incentives that they were given. But when they came to Israel, they were put in homes that belonged to the Palestinians that were either left or kicked out. So in terms of that, I guess that's why I was asking if it would be a different narrative, because I think that it would. Because a Mizrahi would probably say that when they left or when they were kicked out, we came and took their place.
Yeah, I see. I tell you about the origin. This we didn't analyze yet in the survey. I can tell you like this, that in my view, you have to understand most of the Sephardi or Mizrahis, they came to Israel after the war. So they didn't take part in the war. Because what do people say? And I found evidence for this, that people who were in Israel during the war, they knew what happened. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them knew what happened, and they knew some were left voluntarily and some were expelled. But the vast majority of the Sephardi or the Mizrahi Jews, they came after the war. So they didn't have this knowledge about this, and they were socialized and learned the Zionist, what I said called the Zionist narrative, through many ways, through the educational system, and I saw evidence for this in the media and everything. So I would think that many of them, that the vast majority, and don't forget also that they had this, they were not critical oriented. They came from Muslim countries, not with critical thinking, traditional thinking, etc. So I would think that maybe they were more Zionist oriented than the Ashkenazi, some of the Ashkenazi Jews who were in the war and said, and I have all kinds of testimonies, said, we know what happened, we experienced it, we know these things. And about the third question about the gender, so we didn't find any difference in the collective memory, whether between men and women.
Right. I guess my question more was the collective memory mostly constructed by men, or were there also a lot of women that were involved in creating this collective memory?
Well, I have to think, I'm about constructing, so I can think about the institutions. I have 7 institutions which were very central in this thing. So I have to think, because I didn't think about it, so I will deal one by one. So the literature you have 2 main sources which impact collective memory. One of them is the historical memory. So who is knowledgeable about what happened? Or people who research this, or people who experience this. Okay. So the people who experience what wrote the war veterans' memoirs, like Sefer Hagana or Palmach, and also others, also private ones. So they were only men. So if you have one which is called Netiva Ben Yehuda, so she was only one woman which was really a fighter and published a book, and in her book I didn't find anything about this issue. So war veterans' memoirs were constructing only by men. Research I think was mainly, I would say the vast majority was of men. I don't think I found any, there was one, Mary Sirkin, who published, a woman from the US, published some important thing about, but I would say the vast majority were men. In the media, I saw the vast majority were men also.
Yeah, just because I think that gender differences play a big role in perspectives and in communication differences, and so I had a feeling that it was predominantly men.
But maybe you summarize too quickly, because I want to say about a few other institutions. Because in the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Education usually have many women, and all the people who promoted the critical books were women.
Are they the teachers? Or?
No, they were the people. They were the people who were in charge of writing the books. which I'm talking about. So all of them were women. And this was about this. In the National Information Center, there was also, well, the directors were men, but there was also one woman who was, to some extent, she was the director of a subunit, which also she had some impact. And in the army, women got into the picture only, I would say, as I remember, only in the 90s. But yeah, so the picture is not only men, I should say. It's not only men. The NGOs, I can tell you, I found 4 NGOs, only 4 NGOs which dealt with this issue in a little bit significant manner, and yes, it was only men. So mostly men, I would say. Predominantly, yeah. Yes.
Do you think that the fact that all this external critical narrative was being generated hastened the pace at which the Israelis themselves started to adopt the critical narrative?
Yeah, so talking about the critical scholar, the external scholars. Well, this is a very big question which I was debating about. So basically I would say yes. I would say it hastened this, but it would have been, it would have had a larger impact if it was internal, if it was the Israeli scholars.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, but no, I'm telling this because I want to tell you why it impacted, it hastened the process, but not to a very large degree. And this is why, because you have a few big differences between external scholars and Israeli scholars. First, so it had an impact. You should know it had a meeting. For example, I found out that all the critical books, the external critical books which were published in the second period, I found 143 copies of them in about 15 universities and colleges in Israel. So they were disseminated, scholars and students read them in this sense, so they had an impact. But why did they have a lower impact? What's the difference when you have a critical scholar study or an Israeli critical scholar study? So there are a few differences. Usually the external scholars publish in English. And English was, even today, but of course in the 50s and 60s it was much less comfortable for scholars, and not to talk about the public, to read them. Second, and I'm talking here about all kinds of findings which I found which might look small to you, but they have big impact. Second, when you publish abroad, the publisher doesn't have an interest in, of course, when Israel is such a small place, to promote dissemination of the book, and it's different when in Hebrew. Third, when you are an external scholar, you cannot disseminate your findings in other ways. For example, while you teach in the university, while you talk informally with people, while a journalist can interview you. For example, when the people from the Ministry of Education, they wanted to get information about what to include in the books that were published in the 70s, they went to discuss it with scholars. They didn't go to the US to interview a scholar. They went to scholars who live here. So this is one kind of, few kinds of parameters which give external scholars less impact in general. In addition, there was another one or two reasons why these external critical studies in the second periods were less meaningful. They had an impact, but not so much. And these are some clues that I gave in the description of the periods. Because the critical studies in the second period, were the vast majority were of external scholars. But they had problems. They couldn't really get Israeli sources that they can rely on, because war veterans didn't want to give testimonies. Archives were closed. So what did they base all they didn't mention what did they write about, the sources they based their critical argument on, or they took newspaper, which is not really a strong source, or they took, some of them took Arab or Palestinian studies, which for Israelis, they hear it here, it not even come from here and go through the others here, it just bounces back right away. So they had an impact, but not a very strong one, I would say. Yeah. Yeah. What? Which NGOs?
Which four NGOs were you talking about?
Yeah. So the four were like this. The one was Matzpen from 1962. Well, it was founded in 62, but it started dealing with the refugees mostly from the 1967. The second one was the the Alternative Information Center from 1984. The third one is Gush Shalom from 93. And the fourth one is Zochrot from 2002. All the rest, like the peace movement and others, they didn't deal with this issue.
What about ICAR?
Yeah, well, I have to say, like I said, that I analyzed only books which were published by Jews. So I'm dealing only with NGOs which are or only of Jews or at least half with Jews and Palestinian. Otherwise, I could take hundreds of scholars and books and everything, but it doesn't really impact the Israelis, so I took them out.
And then, this is your dissertation, correct? Does it have any section at the end, kind of like what now? What are the implications? What next? Proposing any thoughts for the future after doing all of this research?
Well, the outcomes, well, there are many outcomes to this, but basically the outcomes, if you talk about the research, allows for many things, but generally speaking, to understand how popular, I would say, our official memory is operating, how it is transformed. In addition, since many institutions are also impacting the popular memory, so you can get also knowledge about this, because if you have academia, it also impacts. So how they're operating. It's in terms of the future, it's not really about the future. So if, for example, in the future people would like to say, we have a conflict in Africa or something, and we want to try to change some things. So this will allow for all kinds of insights to try to give advices or something like this. But this can be some future implication about this. Yeah.
How does there's changing the views on this conflict, and how would that, how would that, in your opinion, influence the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians? With the collective memories becoming more critical, and as you said, that younger generations especially adopting a more critical viewpoint, do you think this has any implications towards a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians?
Yeah.
Palestinians?
Well, this is one of the things. Generally, in research, there's not a lot of research about, not a lot, but generally it says that changing collective memory will make your political attitudes, your fear of the enemy, you're willing to compromise, to be more liberal, more tolerant, etc. So in this sense it will promote. Now, but first of all we have to understand that transformation of one event in a conflict doesn't change the whole collective memory of the conflict. And second, collective memory, with all the respect, I researched this and I think it's important, but still it's only one factor. So if, for example, in the political arena, let's say Israelis are afraid of the Hamas or Palestinian and everything, and then there are all kinds of things which are happening, violence is occurring. So collective memory, even if about all the events will be transformed to be more critical, it won't, it cannot change everything. It can have an impact. So I cannot say yes, I cannot say no. It really depends on all these things. But basically, if it changes, it promotes changes in political attitudes, etc. So I guess it's finished. So thank you very much.